We have been working through a series on doubt, and Chris has been taking us through different aspects of doubt. And today, I want to talk about doubt within the context of faith. And so, the question that I want to ask today, this is the big question I want to ask. Is doubt the enemy of faith? And I want to answer that question or explore that question by looking at the story of doubting Thomas from John chapter 20. And I'm hoping that you get the sense that you have full permission to doubt. You have permission to doubt. So let's wrestle with this question. But before we go there, I want to ask another question. What is a caricature? What is a caricature? A caricature is a person, description, or imitation of a person or a thing, and I'm going to add a moment or event in which certain striking characteristics are exaggerated in order to create a comic or distorted effect. So I want to show you a couple of examples, and political cartoons are a perfect example of this, and I am not being political when I show you these cartoons. Here's the first one. Justin Trudeau relaxing at his holiday while the polls are indicating something very different than what he feels at the moment. That's one. Here's another caricature. Polyev, right? Everything is Trudeau's fault. Here's another character. Here's another caricature of a moment that we all shared together this past summer when we were going through the book of Romans. And Kurt said, I hope you're nervous. He said this. And I'm sure he was thinking this. Sorry, Chris, I couldn't resist. But I'm sure you're getting the sense. Caricatures. So doubting Thomas is a caricature. It's an exaggeration. It's a misuse of a feature that does exist in the story. And so this is a caricature, and the Bible never called Thomas a doubting Thomas. That is what we have learned to call him. And so I think this is largely due to the fact that we have come to understand doubt as something negative, a flaw in humanity, perhaps even a sin. At first glance, it appears that according to the words of Jesus, which we're going to see in a moment, Thomas doubted when he should have believed. Therefore, we should all not be doubting Thomases. The problem with this is that we don't all have the same working definition of doubt. And so what is the meaning of doubt? This is the meaning that we've been working with in this series, and it comes from the Webster's Dictionary. Doubt is the feeling of uncertainty about something or someone. So let's keep in mind that when we are talking about doubt, and we see this all over Scripture, especially in the Psalms. So when we are talking about doubt, we are talking about that feeling of deep uncertainty, reservation, inner turmoil, and hesitancy about, you fill in the blank. That's what doubt is. So in other words, doubt is a genuine part of being human. It's a part of the human experience. It just is. It's not a sin. It is not a bad thing, and it is not something that we should feel embarrassed about at all. And so if on the one hand we believe that to be true, then it is a genuine part of the human experience, and yet on the other we tell ourselves that it is something to be avoided at all costs, to push down, we put ourselves into great confusion and existential crisis of faith. we end up making doubt the enemy of faith. Quite frankly, I think that we have been far too hard on Thomas. It is true that Thomas doubted, as we're going to see in the story, but I wonder if this description of Thomas is more of a caricature than it is an accurate description of who Thomas really was. And so let's look at his story. And you know what, if I'm honest, Thomas is my favorite of all of the apostles. So John 20, verse 24, it says this: Now Thomas, also known as Didymus. Now Didymus is the Greek translation of the Aramaic name Thomas, which means twin. Thomas the twin. We actually have no idea what that means, that he's the twin. It's just something that we're supposed to know. But that's not a big deal. But anyway, now Thomas, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. He was not there. And so here's some context before I jump into that. Jesus died on Friday, if you remember. Good Friday, he died. Saturday, he spends the whole day in the tomb. And Sunday morning, he comes alive. The male disciples are in the room because they are terrified. But the women go to the tomb to find it empty. And then they encounter the risen Christ. So they run back to the guys and they say, he is risen. Later that evening, Sunday evening, the disciples were together behind locked doors because they were afraid, and then Jesus appeared in their midst, but Thomas was not there. It's curious that Thomas was absent when Jesus showed up the first time. And here's where some of our assumptions behind the name Doubting Thomas leads us to come down on Thomas. Because first of all, he's doubting Thomas, now he's absent. He's a problem. He's a problem in the church. And so we try to solve that problem. I think that it is worth it at this point to take a step back and to look at the two other places in the Gospel of John that Thomas is mentioned. Because when you go look at these two stories, and these are two very well-known stories, it's going to completely change the way that you view Thomas when you come back to John 20. So here's the first occurrence in John 11. Thomas the courageous. So John 11, verse 6. So when Jesus, heard that Lazarus was sick, so this is the story about Lazarus. He had died. The disciples had found out, and now they are talking about going to Lazarus' place. He stayed where he was for 2 more days, and then he said to his disciples, let us go back to Judea. And here's how the disciples respond. But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago the Jews were there trying to stone you, and yet you are going back? You want to go back to the place where your life was in danger. And here's what Thomas, he speaks up. While all the disciples were scared, Thomas speaks up. And he says this: Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, Thomas the twin, said to the rest of the disciples, let us also go so that we may die with him. So while the rest of the disciples are doubting Jesus and his decision to go back to Judea, Thomas boldly takes the initiative and leads the disciples through their doubt. Thomas is courageous. He is loyal. This is very, very different than the Apostle Peter. We think the Apostle Peter is courageous when he told Jesus, I am ready to go with you, both to prison and to death. We know that phrase that Peter uttered to Jesus, but we also know that just a few verses later, Peter denies Christ 3 times. We don't hear about Thomas denying Christ. He is Thomas the courageous and Thomas the loyal. So that's the first one. The second story is also in a well-known, beloved passage in chapter 14. And this is Thomas the inquisitive. He says, Jesus is talking to them about the place to where he is going. 14 verse 1, do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you? And he goes on, if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you may also be where I am. And then Jesus says this very curious thing. You know the way to the place where I am going. But get this. The disciples don't have the foggiest idea of what Jesus is talking about. They don't have a clue. And again, Thomas speaks up. Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know where you are going, so how can we know the way? And then Jesus responds with one of the most famous phrases that we have in our Christian tradition. I am the way, the truth, and the life. That statement came after Thomas asking a tough question when no one else had the courage to do so. So Thomas speaks out. Wait a minute, you say we know where you are going, but we don't know. So how do we know where you are going? Thomas is an honest, detailed guy. He is not gullible. We wouldn't attach the phrase to him that he is someone of blind faith. He wants to know the details before he can buy in. And that is something that speaks to a profound faith in the heart of Thomas. If something doesn't make sense to him, he has the courage to ask the tough question. And so knowing these two things, Thomas the courageous and Thomas the inquisitive, knowing those two things, when we come back to John 20, we start to see Thomas in a completely different light. It makes sense then, if he is courageous, inquisitive, loyal, it makes sense why some suggest that the reason that he was absent the first time that Jesus showed up is because he retreated to someplace alone to grieve the death of the Messiah. After all, with his own eyes, he saw the Lord crucified. With his own eyes, he saw Jesus buried. Jesus is dead. And that is it. To him, death is final and secure. There is no way around that fact, and how else was he supposed to process this if he doesn't do it alone? And so the other disciples, they respond to Thomas. They told him, we have seen the Lord. But he said to them, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where his nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. For Thomas to hear the sudden news that Jesus is alive and to hear of his appearances to the others, he refused to believe that it had happened. You see, Thomas is not easily swayed by sensational claims. He's unimpressionable. Wait, that's impossible. I saw Jesus suffer and die. He is dead. He has been dead for 3 days. I need concrete evidence. Prove it to me. Remember, Thomas had not gone to the tomb himself. He didn't get that opportunity. He only has secondary sources. So why would any of us, would any of us, without question, have immediately believed that report? I doubt it. Thomas was only asking for evidence to a very sensational claim. And by the way, Thomas was not the only one who doubted. In fact, all of the disciples doubted. For some reason, the Gospel of John seemed to focus in on the character of Thomas. But in reality, Thomas represents the entire group of disciples. Just like Thomas, the rest of the disciples insisted on proof. They insisted on evidence. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through the example that we see in Mark. But I do want to show you Luke. All of the Gospels show doubt on the part of all the disciples. So here's Luke 24, verse 9. When these are the women who come back from the tomb, when they come back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others, but they did not believe the woman, because their words seemed to them like nonsense. That word nonsense comes from another word where we can translate this also as it's an empty fairy tale. What the women were trying to tell them seemed like nonsense. The apostles, they scoffed at the news of an empty tomb. Think of it. The great apostles are the first skeptics of the resurrection. And my favorite example of this is actually in Matthew 28. And here we read, when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. This is a fun one because it takes place right at the end of the book. And it looks very, very different from the other Gospels. Here, the context is what we call the Great Commission. And so up to this point, in Matthew 28, Jesus has already met with the woman. And after the woman meet with Jesus and have their encounter, Jesus tells the woman to tell the rest of the disciples to go and meet him in Galilee at a specific mountain. We don't know exactly which mountain. And so the disciples, they travel to this mountain, and they climb the mountain. And when they reach the top of the mountain, who do they see? They see the resurrected Christ. How is it that someone could stand on top of the mountain, stare into the eyes of the resurrected Christ, and still doubt? Have you ever thought about that? And I would venture to guess that this little story at the end of Matthew 28 is not one that you're familiar with. I certainly wasn't when I started to look at this. And you know what the beautiful thing about this is? It is okay to have doubts and questions. It is okay to have uncertainty and reservation. If the apostle can look at the resurrected Jesus in the eye and still doubt, then to have doubt does not disqualify you from the faith. And by the way, if we look at this passage a little bit closer, we're going to find that there's actually different ways that this passage has been translated. Many translations make it sound like there were some disciples that worshiped and then some disciples that doubted. So, for example, we can think of it this way in the context of Thomas. 11 disciples worshiped him, and Thomas doubted him. That is the challenge of this particular translation, but there is another way to translate this. A case can be made on grammatical and narrative grounds that it is best translated like this. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but were not sure. They were not sure. In other words, it is not that some worshiped and some doubted. They all worshiped and they all doubted. They worshiped with uncertainty. It was too good to be true. Jesus gathered a bunch of worshiping doubters together and they sent them out, and the world has never been the same from that moment on. You and I do not have to choose between faith and doubt. So let's just go back to John 20, verse 26. So this is after Thomas said, unless I see. Now this is a week later. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. So this time, he was not going to miss it. He was going to make sure he was there. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. And then he said to Thomas, put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. A week later. Think about that. A week later. How long did it take for Thomas to see Jesus. And if we spin this around, we can ask it this way. How long does it take for Jesus to see Thomas? A week. Jesus is in no rush. If you read some of the stories, he's not the most punctual guy. In fact, the story of Lazarus, he showed up 4 days late. It's a famous song. 4 days late, but he was still on time. Jesus is in no rush, and he is in no panic to get to Thomas as fast as possible. The point is, Jesus is patient. He doesn't get all worked up inside. He doesn't get all anxious when Thomas has doubts. You see, we are a generation of impatient thinkers. And if you are a Loewen like me, you are a super impatient thinker. Now, that is a Mennonite caricature of a Loewen, so please cut me some slack. But A.J. Swoboda, he is an author who writes a lot on faith and doubt. He says this: rather than trying to fix it right away, what if you sit in the question and let God shape you with the question for a week? Jesus does not always rush in to solve your questions. You know, our youngest daughter, Kaylin, she's 5, almost 6. She's in a really fun stage right now where she's asking some of the most hardest and the most interesting questions about God. Like, how can a big God be everywhere but still live inside my tiny heart? She also just doesn't understand how Jesus could come back to life after dying on a cross. And yet, if you think about it, we're supposed to have faith like a child. Interesting, right? That's a different way of thinking about the command or the encouragement to have faith like a child. Diane will sometimes look at me and say, okay, this one is for you. Good luck. And lately, we have been trying to affirm the beauty of her question rather than trying to come up with an answer to satisfy her curiosity. You don't have to give an answer. We make a big deal about the fact that she asked the question. And sometime, way down the line, we say, that is a phenomenal question, and I don't know the answer to that question. It's okay to doubt. It's okay to sit in your doubt for some time. Because that is a beautiful part of being a human being. But what do we do with this phrase, stop doubting and believe? Because on the surface, it seems to undermine everything I've said up until this point. I think that there is a particular context here where that phrase actually only is applicable to Thomas. He wanted the same proof that his buddies had. We don't have access to that same kind of proof. We don't. And this is not a ticket to go around and tell all the doubters in our midst, stop doubting and believe. Just believe. That's actually extremely destructive to say to someone in their season of doubt, just believe. That is something only Jesus gets to say to Thomas. And our job is to walk alongside those who are doubting. Jude 22 says this: be merciful to those who doubt. Be merciful. A.J. Swoboda, I just quoted him earlier, he said that it is far more important to minister to people in doubt with your presence, with our presence, than with our answers. People who are in seasons of doubt are not looking for answers. Not always. But most importantly, they are looking for a safe place to even ask the question. They are looking for the affirmation to ask it. And the way that Thomas responds is actually quite profound. Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Did you know that as far as we're concerned, Thomas, not Peter, according to John, Thomas was the first person to call Jesus God. He is the first person, or at least the first disciple, to publicly acknowledge his deity. And in doing so, this is extremely fascinating, in doing so, he brings the whole Gospel of John round back to the beginning of the Gospel. And we all know this verse. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And here's the interesting part about this. The majority of scholars, and that's not an understatement, the majority of scholars are in agreement that the Gospel of John actually ends with chapter 20. And chapter 21 was added sometime later as an appendix to the original manuscripts. And so, the Gospel of John starts and finishes with an acknowledgement that Jesus is God. This sheds an entirely different light on the character of Thomas. From all the disciples, Thomas got the last say. From history, we know that Thomas was the first missionary to go to India, and the church movement that he started there still exists to this day. He ministered there for 20 years before he was martyred for his faith. And here's the last verse in this exchange between Thomas and Jesus. Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Jesus is simply giving an encouragement to all those who have come after, subsequent generations. That's us. We are all blessed when, without having seen the risen Lord for ourselves, we still believe him. I don't think that Jesus meant this as a rebuke. He meant this as an encouragement. Not just for all of us who have never seen the Lord, but for those of us who can identify with the character of Thomas. Now, I can feel an anxious question. It's the question, but when does doubt become unhealthy? It's a fair question. And there are different ways that we can address this question, but I would say this. We cannot regulate doubt. You cannot regulate it. You cannot muzzle questions. I think that is the problem. The question is the problem. The problem is not the doubt. The problem is the desire to control them. Think about that. The problem is not the doubt. The problem is the desire to regulate, to control, to squash them. Austin Fisher, another author, he says that people don't abandon faith because they have doubts. People abandon faith because they think that they are not allowed to have doubts. This is especially true when you have a system or a culture within a community that seeks to control the freedom to doubt. And when this happens, those doubts and those uncertainties, they begin to mutate and grow into faith-destroying monsters. The problem is not the doubt. The problem is the desire to control them. So here's 3 things that I want to leave with you about the character of Thomas. 3 things. First of all, Thomas was not kicked out of a community. You think about that? He did not get kicked out. He was not rejected. We don't get a shred of evidence. We don't get a shred of evidence that they had a problem with their doubts. Can you imagine what it would have been like for a guy like Thomas if he had his doubt crisis in a fundamentalist conservative church? They would have told him he didn't believe anymore and that he was doomed to destruction. Too often, our doubts and questions are met with anxiety and fear. Oh no, you're becoming a flaming liberal. What? You have uncertainty about that? Are you okay? Instead of anxiety and fear, try to respond to someone's doubt with loving curiosity. A kind of curiosity that seeks to understand where that person is coming from, that seeks to understand the context from which that question arises. And then stand beside them with your doubt too. Could you have them? He was not kicked out. Number 2, he stayed within the community. He wasn't kicked out, but he also stayed. His questions and doubts were answered from within the community. Our questions and doubts don't always get satisfied with perfectly sounding arguments, but they can be satisfied with another's presence. Don't go this journey alone. Doubt is no reason to abandon the church. And if you are in a season where you are sitting alone in your doubt, don't do it for too long. I would encourage you to not sit in that place of isolation too long. Find someone to talk to. Surround yourself with people that you trust, because we are all worshiping doubters. We all worship with uncertainty in our journey towards becoming like Christ. There's co-curiosity. The co-curiosity of 2 siblings being curious together is a genuine part of being a follower of Christ. And lastly, his doubt beautified his faith and his testimony. You see, doubt is actually the very thing that makes faith possible. There's a little quirky quote by Friedrich Buechner. He said that doubts are the ants in the pants of faith. They keep it awake and moving. I love that quote because it is 100% true. If faith is about being absolutely certain about everything, then why would you even need trusting faith? If our faith is measured by the degree of certainty with which we hold our beliefs, then the natural response to feelings of doubt is panic. And you try to control it, try to push it down, or pretend that it's not there. And when you push stuff down, it comes up in other places. You cannot push it down. That is not the way to deal with doubt, because as human beings, we cannot possibly be certain about everything. And you know what? God is not going to hold you accountable for how certain you are about your faith. And so we don't need to try and convince ourselves and pretend that we know everything. Embrace the doubt and uncertainty. They are not the enemy of faith. A friend of mine recently said this. I am learning to coexist with my doubts. And I'm usually comfortable with that. Usually. Faith is coexistence with our doubts. You coexist with them. And this is beautiful faith. One of the most sacred places in your journey with Christ are those places where you have no answers. It's those places where you don't know what to do. And it's in those moments that we are reminded that the only thing that we have to cling to is Jesus. To struggle with your faith is often the surest sign that we actually have one. And here's something that I want to leave with you. As we close our time together, just consider this. Remember when Jesus, while he hung on the cross in that moment of extreme desperation, he cried out to his Father, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Here's what I want you to consider. And this is a direct quote from Psalm 22. If Jesus can ask this question, if he can ask this question, then we can ask any of ours. If Jesus, as he shared in our humanity, in every way possible, even wrestled with doubt himself as he hung on the cross and cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Then we can too. Then we can wrestle with our doubt too. And if there's anything that I can be certain of, there's not much that I can be certain of, but there's one thing I can be certain of, is that Jesus can handle your doubt. Jesus can handle your question. It is okay. So just take a moment, do a minute to close your eyes and think about the way that Jesus affirms your doubt. Jesus, thank you for not rushing into our doubts in order to satisfy our doubts. But instead, you rush in with your presence. And thank you that you've given us permission to have doubts. And thank you for the character of Thomas, that he is someone who is actually like the rest of us. We all have doubts, and they beautify our faith. Help us to, as we step out of this service into the rest of the week, whether that's work, family, whatever it is, God, I pray that we would be encouraged that doubt is actually a gift that you've given us that helps us and is an integral part of our faith. Thank you, Jesus. Amen.